I will admit that I studied biochemistry because I thought it was easy, and I'll tell you why I think it's easy. But over the years, students have told me that biochemistry can be very difficult. And I think I understand also why students find it difficult. So let's talk about why biochemistry is easy and then why biochemistry is hard. Okay, so biochemistry is the use of chemical principles, right? So you have to understand your chemistry and methods to study and understand the interactions in biological systems, right? So you have to understand what the biological systems are trying to accomplish as well, right? So a good biochemist understands chemistry and understands biology as well. So, biochemistry is easy because it really introduces very little new material. Most of the material we talk about in biochemistry was introduced previously in other classes. Right? In general chemistry, we talked about bonding and intermolecular forces, and pH and buffers, and kinetics and equilibrium, and types of reactions, right? Those are all things that we use in biochemistry, but they were all introduced in general chemistry. In our introductory cell biology or physiology classes, we talked about the major biomolecules like proteins and nucleic acids and fats and sugars and all of those kinds of things. You've already talked about cell structure and what the organelles of the cells do. You've been introduced to the major metabolic pathways, right? These are all things we're going to pick up on and expand on in biochemistry, right? But you already have a beginning on those topics. And from organic chemistry, right? We've talked about organic functional groups, and you've talked about reactions and mechanisms, which we can use to understand biochemistry, right? So most of the information we will talk about in biochemistry, you've been introduced to in other classes, right? All we're going to do is put it together to try to make the whole picture more clear, okay? Right? Biochemistry borrows instrumentation from other disciplines and applies it to understand biological systems, right? So you learned about spectrophotometers in general chemistry, right? Right? You learned about NMR in organic, right? All of those things are also used in biochemistry, right? So biochemistry borrows existing in instrumentation most of the time. Right? So most of the information that we cover in biochemistry, most of the content of biochemistry is really just an expansion on existing material, right? Things you've already learned before. Everything we talk about in biochemistry, you have a head start on. That should make biochemistry easy, right? But students find it difficult. Why do they find it difficult? Well, biochemistry is difficult because its main point is that it integrates material from so many different sources, right? For many students, this is the first really integrative class that they've had, right? Where you're bringing together material from multiple places, all of which you need to be able to grasp and use, right? Now, so this is sort of like assuming that you're always going to be ready for your introductory cell biology final, your general chemistry exam on pH and equilibrium, and know your organic carbonyl reactions always all on the same day, right? Is that realistic? Most students would say probably not, which means that students need to be willing to review. And I think this is where some students, right, because biochemistry relies on so much material from other classes, students forget that it's okay to go back and pick up, a general chemistry text to review something, or a general biology text to review something, or your organic chemistry text to review something, right? So you have to have those materials available, and you need to be willing to use them, right? Pick up an older text and remind yourself at the general biology level what they say about the citric acid cycle before you read the biochemistry text version of what the citric acid cycle does. It's that bringing together material from so many sources that makes biochemistry difficult. Another reason that biochemistry is difficult is biochemistry has its own language, right? Biochemistry uses mostly common names for molecules, and even when it tries to be systematic, it tends to use an older set of rules for systematic naming that's no longer the preferred method in organic chemistry, right? And biochemistry uses older ways of specifying stereochemistry than we learned in organic chemistry. And so biochemists, I often call biochemists, that biochemists are retrochemists because they hold on to all of this older nomenclature that has been, other disciplines of chemistry have moved on from, right? But that means that in order to study biochemistry, we have to be able to learn that language, right? And that takes time, right? There are lots of words, lots of names in biochemistry that we have to take the time to learn in order to understand how those work together to make the system work, okay? And so learning the language can be a difficult part of biochemistry. And really the only way to learn that language is to practice it, to read it, to write it, to speak it, right? You have to practice that language in order to learn it. Biochemistry is difficult because biochemistry starts out with the driest material first, right? But we have to sort of struggle through the dry stuff before we get to the fun stuff. So we have to start out talking about just biological molecules, how they're put together, and then we can understand, right, how they interact before we understand how they work, right? But we have to do that because understanding what proteins are like helps us understand what enzymes do, right? And so once we have learned what the molecules are like, then we can put those things together to understand how the biological systems work. But we start off with sort of dry, straightforward material, right? Before we get to the fun stuff, right? Each biological discipline looks at processes through a single lens, right? From their perspective, right? That tends to create sort of a two-dimensional view, right? In sort of black and white for what that process is doing. When you get to biochemistry, right, you can bring each one of those approaches together, and then by mixing them together, you get a picture in 3 dimensions. and in Technicolor. And that's what I think is so exciting about biochemistry. By the time you really understand biochemistry, some of those things that have been introduced in other classes before, you understand why it's that way, right? You don't just have to memorize why it's that way. You understand why that process does what it does. And that's what the exciting part is about biochemistry and why we can spend so much time working to understand it.